When I first became a homeowner, I learned something that anyone who owns a home learns, I think, very quickly, which is that your tools multiply, right? Because something breaks and you're like, well, I need this to do it. So then you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever and you get that. Now, I don't know about you, but every so often I come home from my trips to Home Depot and my wife is like, what are you getting now? The most latest one where I got some really good side eye was from going ahead and coming back with a sledgehammer. Right? My wife is like, seriously, what do you need a sledgehammer for? And I'm like, I have these big, giant logs. I got to break them up. I got some wedges. We're going to do it. And she's like, fine. But I've learned something about sledgehammers. Sledgehammers have one job, and that job they do well. And when you need a sledgehammer, nothing else will work but a sledgehammer, right? However, if you try to fix everything with a sledgehammer, you break a lot of stuff. Right? I bring that up because very often when we try to theologize about Scripture, when we try to come in from the outside and discern some sort of universal truth, we gotta be careful because theology is a little bit of a sledgehammer. We're trying to say this is black and white rather than a whole bunch of grays. The Corinthians text today is one of those that I think have suffered from sledgehammers hitting it one too many times. Let me walk you through what I mean. See, if you go into this and you theologize it rather than just sort of meet it with spirituality, what you end up with is one of two extremes, which is often what gets preached, often what gets taught, often what gets understood. Neither one is helpful. Let me explain. So on one extreme, what you do is you get obsessed with the list, right? You have the list of spiritual gifts. And if you want to distill it to some sort of perfection, which again, I think is not the goal here, what you do is you say, all right, everybody, there are X number of spiritual gifts. These are the spiritual gifts. If it's not on the list, you don't have it. And by the way, we're going to define it in a very certain way. So teaching must look like, preaching must look like, interpretation of the tongues must look like. What am I talking about? Well, things are always better explained in stories. So both me and my wife are pastors, as most of you know. So we both went to seminary, but we went to different seminaries at different times, mostly because she's way smarter than me, and I would never have been accepted at her seminary. Okay? And here's the weird thing. That meant we had two very different preaching professors at two different times in two different places. And yet, well, they completely disagreed with what good preaching looked like. They were absolutely certain that what they said was the end all in how preaching should be done. My preaching professor, for example, said, you must always be in the pulpit. My preaching professor said, you must always be in the pulpit. What people expect from you is brilliant theological exegesis of the text, and they love it when you quote the Greek and the Hebrew, especially if you use the actual word and pronounce it correctly. I went, really? There's a reason I took a pass-fail. And what they definitely never want you to do is don't be funny. Do not give advice, and do not take on any contemporary issues, because people don't want that. That's not why they go to church. Okay. I mean, I went to church for all the wrong reasons. Now, my wife's preaching professor would have said, you don't preach well unless you got to memorize. You don't preach well unless you take on contemporary issues. You don't preach well unless you get people to laugh every so often or evoke emotion. It's like, well, I would have agreed more with her preaching professor than my preaching professor. The reality is both made the same mistake. Because the mistake when it comes to preaching, and this is true in teaching, this is true in any of these gifts, is to try to prescribe how it should look. Because the reality is, you know what people really care about more than jokes, more than contemporary issues, more than anything when you're a teacher or a preacher or a Christian in any form or fashion? They care about authenticity. You know what people are really good at smelling out? Inauthentic people. See, the best preachers are the ones who are themselves. The best teachers are the ones who are themselves too. One of the biggest mistakes I think administrators make when they look at schools is to try to tell a teacher, this is the way you teach. And if you don't teach this way, you're wrong. Because the reality is, the best teachers I've met in my life are the ones that know themselves, know their style, then look at the students they have in front of them and say, how is it that these kids are going to learn? And find a midpoint between who they are authentically and who the kids are authentically. Those are the best teachers, right? Which means they might teach differently every class or every year or every semester as the students in front of them change and their needs change. Not because there's anything right or wrong about anyone in that group, but because everyone's different, and that's beautiful. See, when we get obsessed about exactly what are the gifts or exactly how they should come out, we go to a bad place. Because with spirituality, rather than theology, it's often about balance, not extremes. Now, there's another extreme on this. I told you there were two extremes. The other extreme is to forget the first paragraph, right? First paragraph says, these are the spiritual gifts that are of that Spirit, the Spirit of God, right? And are being used for the common good, right? Those are sort of standards, right? If you're not using it for the common good, or it's not really the Spirit of God, then you're not dealing with a spiritual gift, you're dealing with something else. And it's okay to say, yeah, that's not actually a good thing. Let me explain what I'm talking about. As you all know, I dealt with troubled churches early on in my career, and one of the things that happens in troubled churches is that they tolerate behaviors that outside of the church, no one would ever be okay with. Like if you did this to your doctor, or you did this to a fellow patient, or you did this to a fellow student, or you did this to a fellow employee, people would be like, oh my goodness, everywhere else. But then in church, I'd be like, hey, did you all know this happened? This isn't okay. And then the church would be like, but we're Christians, we're called to be nice. And I go, no, that's not in the Bible. Nowhere. We're called to be loving, caring, compassionate, love diversity, fight for justice. Nice? No, not necessarily. Like we should be as nice as we can. Let me explain what I mean. So I was sitting with a good friend of mine, and you got to understand who this guy is to make the story make any sense. He's one of those amazing people that the first half of his career, he was a bartender, and he was a darn good bartender. Second half of his career, he was a college professor. So he is one of those rare humans that can walk into a classroom and lead a lecture in front of 300 people of high intellectual, bookish knowledge that goes way above my head. Do that brilliantly, turn around, pour you a drink, say, how's your day doing, and be one of the best bartenders in the world. Because he gets both sides. Okay? Rare human being. Now, he's a devout atheist, and I'm sitting there across from him, and I'm complaining about the churches I was working with and talking about these horrible things that were going on, how people are treating each other, and this isn't okay, and da-da-da-da. And he finally looks at me, he's like, they just don't get the idea of cultural architecture at all. And I'm like, sure, because I totally know what that means. And he's like, let me explain it to you. He said, when I was a bartender, I'd work at these bars. When you open a new bar and you put yourself, let's say, mid-price new bar for whatever area you're in, you're going to get a cross-section of humanity there for the first few weeks, maybe first month or so. But everyone who comes into that bar who's a customer is asking themselves something. And that question is this my sort of place? Right? And well, who your servers are and who your bartenders are and your ambiance, all that plays into it. But what really plays into it is who else they see and what are the other customers doing. I said, okay, I guess that makes sense. Where are we going with this? He's like, here's what happens, is in any community out there in America at any given time, there is a Nazi biker who wants a beer. Okay? The Nazi biker is going to come into your bar at some point and order some sort of drink. Okay? And of course, you're going to serve him a drink. Everyone's money's good. Okay, fine. He said, however, that Nazi biker, because he's a Nazi biker, is going to start causing trouble. Right? He's going to start roughhousing or speaking bad or saying inappropriate things, because that's what they do. And you as the bartender, or you as the owner, or the floor manager, or whoever, has to make a quick decision. The quick decision is this. Do you confront him, or do you let the behavior continue? If you let the behavior continue because you want the beer sale, you've doomed the bar. Because what happens is in round one, sure, you make an extra sale that night for however much he drinks. Round two, all your families with kids leave because they go, I don't want that here. That is terrifying. That is dangerous. This is not what I want my kids to learn. So they leave. Your Nazi biker guy tells all his other buddies, like, hey, there's a place that will take us because most places kick us out. So now you got him and his buddies, and now they're causing more of a ruckus. This continues to go and go and go until you're a Nazi biker bar. Because if you never hold anyone accountable, that's all you're going to end up with. Because all the good folks, they're going to leave and find another place because they don't feel safe, understandably. Churches, having dealt with churches that have troubles before, and this isn't just true of churches, this is true of the local fire department, this is true of companies, this is true any place that has its own culture. You've got to go ahead and welcome everybody in. You also have to have standards for how people treat each other. Because if you don't, you're going to just go down the road like that bar. Having those standards are okay. That's why in this entire discussion of spiritual gifts, they start off with the standards. They say it needs to be for the common good. It needs to be of the Spirit of God. They give you a list, not because the list is exhaustive. I can think of spiritual gifts I've seen that aren't on that list at all. But they give you a list to give you an idea of things like this. Why? Because hate is not a spiritual gift. Being mean is not a spiritual gift. Picking on others or bullying is not a spiritual gift. Why? Because none of that helps the common good at all. None of that is what the Bible talks about at all, right? We talk about love, compassion, mercy, justice. See, when we look at the spiritual gifts, when we look at these extremes, we have to find a balance. A balance where we realize my spiritual gift and your spiritual gift, even if they're the same one, might look dramatically different, and that is beautiful because it's going to be as different as God made us. But we can also appreciate all that diversity, all that difference, love all those people, and still say, there's a way we treat each other and a way we don't. Why? Because we're Christians. When I talk about the spiritual gifts, the ones that are so easily overlooked, the wedding at Cana is a great example of it. Mary's big spiritual gift is that she is spunky. Right? We talked about that all through Christmas. She is strong, she is spunky, she is willing to say it. The irony is on this one moment, on this one day, she did one of her not particularly spunky things. She goes to her 30-year-old son who's still living at home and says, dude, you're the Messiah. It's time to get moving. You know what? Why don't you go turn this water into wine and get us rolling? Okay, which is why he responds with, Mom, what is this to you and me? We don't care how the wedding goes. We're barely related. These feels like third cousin, fifth time removed. And as a good spunky mom would do, turns to him and goes, hey, servants, whatever he ends up telling you to do, just do that because he will be doing this. I can almost see the direct going on. She did many greater, more spunky things in her life. This one launched the salvation of the world. That's the other thing to remember about spiritual gifts. People sometimes look down at their own and say, oh, what does it matter? You never know. Because the history of God is God taking really ordinary things, really small things, and doing extraordinary things with them. So as you go out, ask yourself the same question I posed to the students this morning. What is it you are good at? What is it you love doing that you're good at? And how can you, in the Spirit of God, help the common good with those gifts?